Chicago's OBlock is notorious for its high crime rates and low quality of life. And curiously, the block has acquired something of a media hype and pop culture. On one hand, it's derided for its murders and gun crime, but on the other, it's cultivated famous rap artists like Chief Keef and King Von. Some people claim that these rappers exaggerate certain aspects of the neighborhood for their music, insisting that there are worse neighborhoods than OBlock on Chicago's South Side. This opinion, however, should be taken with a grain of salt. While some neighborhoods might be worse than those in Parkway Garden Homes, it does not excuse the situation there. Roaches and rodents roam the hallways of the buildings. Trash sits in a heap around the corner, and on top of it all, occasionally, the streets ring with the sounds of bullets. So, what is the mystery behind this unique neighborhood's reputation? Join me to find out as today we discover the history of Chicago's OBlock. I'm your host, Ryan Socash, and you're watching It's History. Our story begins with the segregated white city on Chicago's 63rd Street and South Parkway, now known as Martin Luther King Jr. Drive. Constructed in 1905, sometimes listed as the White City Amusement Park in print media, it should not be confused with another amusement park that was responsible for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893. Built on 14 acres of land, it was one of the biggest amusement parks in the U.S. at the time of its opening. The ballroom in one of the buildings could fit 1,000 dancers, and a restaurant, the College Inn, could seat 2,500 diners. The park's signature White Tower could be seen from 15 miles away, earning White City the title, the City of a Million Electric Lights. There was no general admission ticket, but African Americans were, let's say, discouraged from attending. Names like the White Tower and White City carried a great significance for people who were not allowed inside. One of the park's games was called African Dip, and involved white patrons hurling projectiles at a black person, an activity that sounds disgraceful at the least. However, segregation eased up once more black people moved to the area for lesser jobs like this one. The Great Depression took a toll on the project, and by 1933, the company that owned it could not pay taxes. In 1946, White City's facilities were auctioned off. The land was designated for large-scale, multi-family residential developments for African Americans. An ironic gesture, one has to say. And so it was. America's first cooperatively owned African American housing development opened in 1955. The low-income apartment complex would go on to house 20,000 residents. This place, known as the Parkway Garden Apartment Homes, nestled between Woodlawn and Washington Park, would ultimately become known as the OBlock. Henry K. Holzman was the architect chosen to design the apartment complex. He had worked as a contractor in Chicago from 1891 to 1893, before becoming a partner in the firm Brainerd Holzman Architects from 1893 to 1897. After the markets crashed in 1929, his firm started designing affordable residential housing projects in Illinois. This opinion, however, should be taken with a grain of salt. He was involved in major housing projects over the next few years, and by the latter 30s was receiving funding from the Federal Housing Authority for designing his own projects. In 1932, he wrote a book, Rehabilitating Blighted Areas, Studies of Blighted Areas, How They Evolve and Their Effect on Society, which was published by the Architects Club of Chicago. In 1945, he published two more works regarding urban homes and the idea of mutual ownership. In 1937, Moholy Nagy, the influential Hungarian artist, opened the new Bauhaus, American School of Design, in Marshall Field's unused South Prairie Avenue mansion, also known as Field's Victorian. Holzman was the director of the Association of Arts and Industry and was heavily involved in bringing the Bauhaus sensibilities to Chicago. He worked on apartment complexes in the city's north, including the Winchester Hood and the Lunt Lake Apartments, before moving to the Parkway Garden Apartment Homes, originally known as O'Donnell Homes. Holzman's firm went bankrupt from the project, and he was convicted for mail fraud. The O'Donnell Homes was among his final projects. Today, the Parkway Homes District, located in the grander Grand Crossing community, consists of 35 buildings, 11 of which have elevators. The Bauhaus approach is evident here, as Holzman focused on functionality, efficiency, and addressing the social needs of the residents. But let's refer to a moment to the landmark nomination for the apartment homes, which reads, quote, "The buildings are minimally decorated with early modernist features, including offset canted window bays, projecting cantilevered balconies at the open stairwells, corner ribbon windows, and streamlined concrete entrance canopies. The landscaping with the Parkway Garden Homes District is simple and functional. The symmetrical arrangement of buildings on the 15-acre site creates primary and secondary areas of outdoor space within the complex. The primary elevation of buildings generally front inwards towards informal courtyards or transitional spaces with open lawns framed by curved intersecting pedestrian pathways that connect to various areas throughout the complex." The African American communities in the city's south side actually ended up here during the Great Migration from the South. When Southern states passed Jim Crow laws against African Americans, barring them from public facilities, discriminatory laws coupled with routine lynchings forced Black communities to migrate north. Chicago was the most accessible city for people moving out of Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, and Arkansas. Before the Second World War, the African American wave comprised mostly of rural Southerners. Most of them had been laborers, but a few were landowners who were pushed out because of the boll weevil infestation. They took time to assimilate into Chicago's urban culture. In the 1940s, however, the arriving African Americans were mostly urban, slightly more skilled, and consequently a tad more ambitious. As almost 3,000 African Americans arrived in Chicago every week at one point in the 40s, the local inhabitants were worried for their jobs and the changing dynamics of the city. Even the older migrants knew that they could lose their jobs to younger workers. Most of the migrants settled in the South Side due to the steel and meatpacking industries there, forming what most historians call the Black Belt. The belt stretched for 30 blocks along State Street on the South Side and was around 7 blocks wide. The sudden influx meant that Jim Crow laws unfortunately found their way into the state as well, and Black people had to contend with radically restrictive covenants, among other things. Even though the Supreme Court ruled that these covenants were unconstitutional, the homeowner associations discouraged selling houses to Black families. The Black Belt consisted of a few neighborhoods that were open to Black families, so it quickly became overcrowded. Almost 3/4 of the city's Black population lived here by the mid-20th century. A 1934 census estimates that the city's Black household contained 6.8 people on average, in contrast to white households, which had 4.7. So the development of housing projects like the Parkway Garden Apartments was a measure taken to ease the overpopulation issue. However, it should be pointed out that the Belt was not a homogeneous zone of African Americans. It was varied and diverse, with poor and affluent neighborhoods. Equality still represented in the South Side of Chicago. Anyhow, the circumstances in the majority of the Belt called for solidarity, so the communities encouraged and supported local businesses. Chicago African Americans had unprecedented access to city jobs and boasted seats in local and state government. Other pros included Chicago jazz and the Harlem Renaissance. The economic condition dipped after the Great Depression, but was rising again after the Second World War. Between 1940 and 1960, the city's population grew from 278,000 to 813,000. Chicago was being referred to as, quote, the Black capital of America, with prominent public figures like William L. Dawson, the Democratic congressman, and Joe Louis, the boxing champion. But all of this underscores the discrimination that still existed in the city. Store clerks, bus drivers, police officers, and firefighters, among other jobs, were highly restricted to white people. and schools were still desegregated. All of this led to the formation of the Chicago Freedom Movement in the 1960s, the giants from the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 translated really well into the new movement. Al Raby's Coordinating Council of Community Organization received support from Martin Luther King Jr.'s Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but open housing remained a divisive issue among the city's radically polarized population. Street crime remained a low priority for the police in the African American neighborhoods, leading to an increase in drugs, crime, poverty, and infant death rates. The deindustrialization in the 1970s did little to alleviate the situation, as jobs became even scarcer for the city's south side. Things continued to get progressively worse as the Reagan administration slashed social welfare programs in the 1980s. Decades of neglect resulted in a wave of political activism, and Chicago elected its first black mayor, Harold Washington, in 1983. But the mayor could do little to assuage the situation in the city's decrepit neighborhoods and their fragile dynamics, as the predominantly white council opposed him on every count. In the 1990s, accusations of racial profiling and the declining black communities forced the city to take remedial actions. From there, $1.5 billion was allocated to remove 51 high-rise project buildings and replace them with mixed-income housing. For most, however, mixed-income housing was merely a euphemism for the removal of poor people. And it's here that I need to warn you, the next chapters of the story might be particularly upsetting, especially with the holidays upon us, as even in places like Chicago's OBlock, family and tradition are the people's main priorities. Yet, seeing how things unfold in the projects, especially during the holidays, might make you reflect upon the future and how important it is to take responsibility for the ones you love, and life insurance is the perfect place to start. Thanks to the sponsor of this video, Policy Genius, finding a solution won't be hard. As a father myself, I made sure to get reliable life insurance, and if you'd like to do the same, Policy Genius is the perfect place to start. Their technology makes it easy to compare quotes from top insurers, so you'll always have the lowest price. In fact, with Policy Genius, you can find life insurance policies that start at just $292 per year for $1 million of coverage. Some options offer same-day approval and avoid unnecessary medical exams. And you can trust their guidance, as their licensed agents work for you, not the insurance companies. So it's no wonder they have thousands of 5-star reviews on Google and Trustpilot. Your family deserves peace of mind. A life insurance policy through Policy Genius can give it to them. So head to policygenius.com/itshistory or click the link in the description to get your free life insurance quotes and see how much you could save. Thank you to Policy Genius for supporting the channel, and now, back to Chicago's OBlock. All of this brings us to the Parkway apartment homes stretching from 63rd to 66th along King Drive and its problems in the 21st century. The O'Donnell homes, as they were originally called, occupy the boundary of Woodlawn and Washington Park. Now, some people claim that the OBlock is not as bad as the media makes it out to be. Other neighborhoods are statistically worse, but still, you have to contend with the fact that it is surrounded by most of those neighborhoods. West Woodlawn to its east, Washington Park to its north, and Inglewood on its west are all dangerous neighborhoods. And the Greater Grand Crossing that OBlock belongs to does not have a great reputation either. Violent crimes like murder or assault on females are almost 700% higher in the Washington Park neighborhood than the national average. With 11 cases of assault, robbery, burglary, and stolen property laying in wait for the area's approximately 12,000 residents every day, this spot is often avoided by outsiders. While Hyde Park to the east is fairly safe, West Woodlawn has high crime rates as well. It should be noted that some recent social programs like Project Hood have helped alleviate crime in the neighborhood. So does that make it safe, you ask? No. The crime rate is 1.7 times higher than the city on average. To the west, Inglewood's 26,000 locals experience violent crimes about 8 times more than the average U.S. city. In 2022, 2,837 per 100,000 people were assaulted, according to official figures. Moving by foot is highly discouraged in all of these areas, especially for female travelers at night. You might ask, but why is violence so rampant in these specific areas and not Chicago's entire Black Belt? The answer is fairly straightforward. The Black Belt has historically had rich zones and poor zones. The rich zones have fared relatively well, but some neighborhoods have been neglected. Discrimination, inadequate social structures, housing issues that made it hard to afford housing in other parts of the city, and some inept political ideas like middle-income housing have led to more problems than solutions. Gangs have become a staple of these neighborhoods, and rivalries between said gangs result in several casualties each year. The rising influence of gangs also means that they're at liberty to harass the locals. The Great Grand Passing was not immune to these historical changes and shortcomings. With 8,198 reported crimes per 100,000 people in 2021, it is one of the worst neighborhoods on the South Side. Regular police patrols have not been able to curb the crime. Every resident of its 32,000 population has a 1 in 13 chance of becoming the next crime victim. Little to no hotels in this neighborhood are recommended to any tourists. The Parkway Apartment Homes facility that sits in its north is emblematic of the greater problems of the Greater Grand Crossing and its surrounding communities. The biggest issue here is the rivalry between two major gangs, Black Disciples and Gangster Disciples, that reside just a block away from each other. From the late 2000s to the early 2010s, the infamous OBlock became the center of gang shootings. Most of the people involved in these crimes, both perpetrators and victims, were often teenagers and young adults. Even the name OBlock comes from a particular incident, an incident that I can't really describe here on YouTube, but ended in the death of O.D. Perry, a 20-year-old member of BD whose life was taken by a 17-year-old female from GD. The story of these gangs starts back in 1958 when a group of young teenagers in Inglewood formed an alliance by the name of Devil's Disciples. With David Barksdale as their leader, the idea was to integrate smaller gangs into the area to form several factions of the Disciples. In 1966, the gang was referred to as Black Disciple Nation, which helped increase recruitment numbers. The Disciples had had a years-long war with the Supreme Gangsters, but by 1969, the two sides had agreed to a ceasefire and merger of both groups, resulting in the creation of Black Gangster Disciple Nation, or BGDN. If these names are confusing, fear not, for they're about to get even more so in the next few minutes. Barksdale had assumed control of the larger group, but by 1974, he was dead too, shot in the kidney. The void at the top resulted in a severe crisis, as different members of the gang had different plans for the future. Some wanted to stick together, while others did not. The difference materialized in the form of a split, the Black Gangster Disciples and the Black Disciples. The official year for the split is 1972. Things kept heating up, and by the late 80s, there were several factions in the place of one. The Black Gangsters, the Black Disciples, the Gangster Disciples, the Latin Disciples, the Spanish Gangster Disciples, and more. Larry Hoover, the leader of the old Supreme Gangsters, had been incarcerated for life on murder charges, but was able to pull some strings. He managed to unite these splintering factions into an alliance. Hoover's tunnel vision, focusing on the Gangster Disciples, meant that he blatantly ignored the interests of other factions. From there, things started to spiral out due to the infighting that happened in 1991. The leader of Black Disciples, Mickey Bull, was shot to death. He had agreed to Hoover's peace agreement, but some members of the Black Disciples had splintered from their group, forming an alliance with the Gangster Disciples. The revenge was served cold as the Black Disciples killed 3 members of the Gangster Disciples. From 1991 to 1994, this rivalry reached its absolute peak. Eventually, the Black Disciples leader, Marvel Thompson, intervened to put an end to the violence. But his story didn't end there. Thompson was arrested by the FBI in 2004 for selling illicit substances and mortgage fraud. These gangs are big today, and a 2017 DEA report estimates that there are over 100,000 active gang members in the Chicago metropolitan area. The DEA also reports that the gangs are not restricted to Chicago, as they are involved in the transportation and distribution of illegal substances across multiple states. For instance, the gang Disciples are thought to have 50,000 to 90,000 followers across 100 cities and 31 states, mostly in the Midwest and Southeast. Their source of income? Street-level distribution of forbidden substances. Other gangs like Black Peace Stone Nation, Vice Lords, Latin Kings also hold sway in the region, and needless to say, all of these gangs are not too happy with each other. OBlock, where the Black Disciples maintains a heavy presence, falls under the purview of Chicago Police Department Beat 312, between 63rd and 65th Streets. From the late 2000s to the early 2010s, gang shootings skyrocketed in the area. Community leaders claim that the spike arrived in the wake of Chicago Housing Authority's demolition of the crime-infested Randolph Towers. This building on 6217 South Calumet Avenue, nicknamed Calumet Building, was the base operations of Black Disciples. According to the Chicago Tribune, the Randolph Towers were reportedly hauling in illicit trade profits of $300,000 per day around 2004. The authorities have recently taken some steps to curb the crime, but it's still a big part of life in this part of town. Between June of 2011 and June of 2014, 19 people were shot in OBlock, making it the most dangerous block in the country in terms of shootings. 2 of the 19 victims died, others were paralyzed for life, and some rare cases received a second lease on life without any physical leverage. While most major cities anywhere around the world have their fair share of violence, the violence in this particular community is different. For the most part, it is senseless violence between teenagers and young adults over petty arguments, with bullets sounding every other day in the vicinity and a general sense of aggression all around. The residents get desensitized to the violence, especially the younger ones. One of the major problems of the OBlock community is that most kids are not in school. The education system has a hard time competing with the influence of gangsters roaming the streets. More than its impoverished locals, more than its high crime rates, and more than anything else, OBlock is known for the innovation of drill music. As the adage goes, the easiest way to survive adversity is to laugh through it. So it makes sense that in this part of the world, mirrored by crime and chaos, people would find creative outlets for positive expression. Rappers like Chief Keef, Lil Durk, King Von, and Fredro Santana all hail from Parkway Garden Homes. Drill music is a variation of gangster rap, talking about the violence in a confrontational and explicit manner. With a slightly slower tempo than trap music, drill music hovers around 60 to 70 BPM. The drill scene came into the mainstream around 2012 with Chief Keef as its main poster boy. The scene would impact Chicago hip-hop and hip-hop across the country before finding new footing in Europe just a few years later. The emergence of drill music was a catalyst for reducing the crime rate, but there was another major event around the same time that yielded interesting results. In 2011, the real estate firm Related Companies purchased Parkway Gardens. The company collaborated with local authorities like HUD and local police to renovate the place. By 2013, the $40 million renovation was complete. The company also constructed a new structure capable of housing 2,000 people. The music and renovation reduced the crime rate for a while before it rose once again. The pandemic also helped reduce the shootings, but senseless violence still prevails in the OBlock. From the outside at least, it seems that no law-abiding citizen wants to live in this neighborhood. which is understandable as the criminals are exploiting the youngsters for financial gain. They won't move out anytime soon. The problem is so hard-coded in the history of the city and the policies of its major institutions that a reprieve could only come in the form of some major prophetic changes. Changes that I imagine everyone is hoping for, but changes that are also in the hands of the citizens of Chicago. So we'll leave it there for now, but thank you all for watching, and until next time, this is Ryan Socash, signing off.